Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the third in a series of webinars under the Western Governors Association's Working Lands Roundtable. Today's webinar will be examining the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on gateway communities. My name is Laura Cutlip. I'm a policy advisor at WGA, and before I turn things over to today's moderator, I'd like to take a moment to provide a bit of background on the Working Lands Roundtable for those who might not be familiar. The Working Governors Working Lands Roundtable was officially launched in 2018 following a number of successful natural resource-focused WGA chairs initiatives. And the roundtable serves in part to continue the implementation of those initiatives, but also to examine the cross-boundary and multidisciplinary nature of resource management issues. Through the roundtable, WGA seeks to tap into the expertise of a wide range of resource management and conservation professionals to engage in discussions on large-scale cross-boundary policy solutions that enhance the resiliency of Western working landscapes and the communities that they support. I will note that this webinar also serves as a continuation of a series examining the impacts of COVID-19 on resource management under the WGA Working Lands Roundtable, and you can find those previous sessions on WGA's website at westgov.org, and you can go ahead and take a listen to those. Today, we are joined by Tara McKee with the Utah Office of Outdoor Recreation, who will be moderating the session. And I will let Tara and the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but first, some quick logistics. Each panelist will deliver brief opening remarks, and following those, we will turn to a moderated discussion. And then after the moderated discussion among the panelists, we will open up a question and answer session to all the attendees. To ask a question, you can write your question in the attendee chat function, which is on the left side of your screen. And you can do that at any point at the webinar, and I'll be monitoring those questions and save them for the Q&A portion at the end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on WGA's YouTube channel as well as on the website westgov.org/initiatives under the Working Lands Roundtable heading. And now I will hand things over to our moderator, Tara McKee.
Thank you, Laura. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion as we talk about COVID's impacts on gateway communities. With the natural resources around them, these communities are very tourism dependent, and most of the time they're in very rural areas. The effects that were first seen is this concern that healthcare systems, some of them have public hospitals that could easily get overwhelmed. So in the spring, many of them, as we all participated in the stay safe, stay home, or whatever different restrictions that were held in different states, because there was concern that not only would the bed capacity be overwhelmed, but that emergency systems would likewise be overwhelmed. Often ambulance services aren't to the point that one or two employees being out might be the entire system. So priority one has been keeping the towns healthy, and that continues, I'm sure, to be a priority, but with the restrictions that have previously kept people home being down, there is this pent-up demand for people getting outside and getting into new places as they have gone a little cabin fever crazy. So there is this priority to keep the towns healthy. And what might those initiatives be? It'd be very interesting to hear what those might be. Some towns are considering, hey, we'll use some of the street parking space that we have to expand outdoor dining on the sidewalks so that there could be better ways to socially distance as we accommodate tourists in and help our restaurants to safely reopen. But there are other protocols that are being considered as these towns act quickly to respond and to keep their workforce healthy and safe, and their residents, some of which are very vulnerable populations. And then the priority for the long term would be the economic health of the town. How do they plan for those long range effects? Um, the you know the tax base that funds town services, social services, schools, health services. That's going to be a concern in the long term, and so being able to accommodate some tourism and be able to get those taxes that really fund a lot of things that these towns does is a concern. They may have to do with a reduced budget. There are other things, but in the meantime, safely reopening in this new normal of a summer tourism season is a concern. So tourists are coming, but the patterns have changed. They're driving to these communities rather than flying in. Here in Utah, we're seeing national parks. That are opened. They're allowing up to 2/3 or 3/4 of their quote unquote normal capacity before they stop further entrances. Um, they are reporting about 70 to 80% of the licenses that they're seeing on cars are from out of state. So there is this driving across state boundaries and mixing up. And some of these visitors are new to this type of trip. So they don't always know the general rules. Our Forest Services are reporting campsites with a still burning fire left behind. So these are people that aren't new to camping and they don't know the safe principles of putting out fires, which could be a concern for wildfires. They're also seen in our national parks, people that don't know kind of rules of national parks, and they're thinking, hey, the campground's full, I'll just camp anywhere. That's not usually allowed in the national parks, but they're finding it's more out of ignorance than willful um, desire to just go against the rules and things like loose dogs and so forth. But the recently released National American Camping Report shows that half of leisure travelers are planning on replacing one of their canceled trips this summer with a camping trip or a road trip. And this is going to bring them into these gateway communities. They're stating that the top reason they're going to be coming to these communities is they want to spend time outdoors after staying at home so long. And the next reasons that they add are connected to the affordability of these road trips and the perception that being outside is an easier way to practice social distancing. And what's interesting is that people that were included in this poll were non-campers, and they're considering going camping for the first time. Um, that particular non-camping group is more looking towards the non-tent kind of camping, the renting of RVs, staying in cabins, whether they're rustic or a little more, shall we say, well supplied, or trying glamping. And so that's going to affect these communities as these visitors come in, maybe very new to the area, and how are communities going to manage this with their restaurants, hopefully their guides and outfitters, um, and so forth. It's going to be a different type. We don't have our international travelers that spend a lot of money, but we are hoping that there can be some economic benefits that make it worth opening up your community to visitation. And I would say with the communities as we go on, and I'm going to introduce Danya Rumore, but as a state person, I would want to know with these communities what they are looking at the state. for those resources, whether it's marketing or economic resources. How can we be better supportive of you in your communities? And with that, I'm going to introduce Danya Rumore, the director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Environmental Dispute Resolution program at the University of Utah.
Good morning, everyone. Looks like my slides might have got moved around a little bit, but hopefully you can see there's a couple links there to the program I run, the Environmental Dispute Resolution Program, and also a link to the NAR initiative, which we're going to talk about throughout today. So as Tara said, I'm Danya Amore. I run a program called the Environmental Dispute Resolution Program, which really tries to support collaboration throughout the Mountain West. And through that work, I've been doing a lot of work with gateway communities over the last many years. And I just want to say thank you to the Western Governors Association for hosting this conversation, because I think gateway communities have a lot of unique challenges they share across communities. And I think they need a lot of help, and COVID's just really driven that home and illuminated some new vulnerabilities. I want to apologize. I meant to put a picture of myself on my opening slide, but forgot to do so. The good news is I have a unique name. So if you want to know what I look like, please look me up online. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I have been working in gateway communities for many years, including working pretty intensively with the Zion National Park region for about the last 5 years, helping to help catalyze and then facilitate an effort we call the Zion Regional Collaborative, or the ZRC. And that initiative was really started because of the visitation-related pressures, the kind of things that Tara is talking about in the national park and in the communities, other public lands and areas around the national park. Next slide. I also have the good fortune to be from a gateway community. I'm from Sandpoint, Idaho, in far northern Idaho, and as you can tell, it's a pretty lovely place to call home. I have to say, since the Sandpoint region is growing quite rapidly, I feel obliged to ask you all to tell your friends that Idaho sucks. Don't want to move there. But through work, really observing Sandpoint, the Zion region, and other gateway regions throughout the West, and working with these places, it became very clear to me and many colleagues I work with that Western gateway regions are becoming increasingly popular places to live and to visit. And this in turn is creating a number of impacts for these communities. Everything from concerns about sprawl in a place like Sandpoint, which is a small town, to some of the issues we hear about crowding and impacts on recreation infrastructure, as well as critical and often quite acute issues with affordable housing in many of these communities, including communities of only 500 people, which is pretty unique for rural areas. And then issues even like overwhelming wastewater infrastructure. And basically, as my research team and I have taken to saying, we're seeing a variety of big city problems in these small towns. And again, the issues on the public lands as well that Tara, I think, did a pretty good job of talking about. Next slide. So in response to that, Jake Powell, who is also on the call, and I and a number of colleagues have launched what we call the Gateway and Natural Amenity Region Initiative. And the idea behind this initiative is really to provide research, education, and capacity building efforts to help understand what's going on in gateway regions throughout the West, get students involved in these places, and more than anything, provide support and really help these places deal with the challenges they're facing. Just to avoid any confusion, I'll note that both Jake and I might have the tendency to use NAR, or Gateway and Natural Amenity Region, in talking about gateway communities, since we use the two interchangeably. And part of why we talk about these places as Gateway and Natural Amenity Region communities is because so many of the places we're studying and working with don't consider themselves the gateway communities. Often it's places like Driggs in Idaho that are receiving the overflow from Jackson, Wyoming, as that area gets too expensive or too built out. So we really use this as a very inclusive term and think of gateway communities as not just the Moabs, but the places you haven't heard of that are maybe starting to feel some of the impacts, or might be the next place to start to feel the impacts. I'm going to leave it to Jake, who's going to go next, to talk a little bit more about the NAR initiative and what we've been up to and what we're learning along the way. But I want to now tie this back to COVID. Next slide. So as folks may know, gateway communities have been some of the hardest hit places in the West from COVID-19 in terms of actual rates of COVID-19, and also, as Tara is alluding to, and as we'll talk a lot about today, economically. And what's interesting to me is two years ago, we ran a survey of gateway communities throughout the West and asked about what challenges these communities are facing, the things they're concerned about. And not a single community talked about the risk of pandemic. It just wasn't on our radar at all. And what we found is largely due to the transience of the populations in these communities, be it visitors moving in and out of these communities, second homeowners, or even just the people who live in these communities but do so maybe for just a small part of the year. These communities are quite vulnerable to actual spread of the pandemic. And as Tara alluded to, few, if any, really have the health infrastructure to deal with this kind of a challenge. A lot of these communities have 1 or 2 beds to deal with somebody who's really, really, really sick. And so there's been a huge public health concern. And then, as we probably all know quite well, there's the whole economic concern of shutting down economies. It's the effect of everybody, but economies highly dependent on tourism are just that much more vulnerable. So with that, I'm going to shift it over to Jake Powell, who can talk a little bit more about what we're doing and what we're learning about how communities are experiencing and responding to COVID-19.
Yes, I just want to introduce Jake. Of course, as you can see on the screen, he is the extension specialist in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at Utah State University, and we've had the pleasure to be working together in different ways for the last few years. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Tara. Danya did a wonderful job of explaining sort of the background of how the NAR initiative was envisioned and created, and it's been really great to work with her and her research team to help identify and do some research and help these gateway communities. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about what the NAR initiative is doing and a little bit about what we're hearing from gateway communities and their regions across the Western United States. So some things that we're doing, there's a lot of information out there that people are trying to provide to gateway communities, and they're doing a wonderful job of it. What we felt like our role was as the NAR initiative was really providing linkages between these communities, their regions, and resources and information that can be most beneficial. So a couple of ways we've been doing that. The first of which, if you can go to the next slide, is we've been hosting a series of listening sessions where, in order for us to respond and provide feedback and capacity building resources, we first wanted to hear from communities and understand what they're up to. And so we started with this idea of a listening session, and you can see on the web link there, there's linkages to all of the work that we've done. So if anybody's interested in seeing some summaries of the listening sessions, or perhaps even watching some of the work we've done, there's links there. But we're also starting to do some research that is targeted in a couple different ways about larger gateway community challenges. We're also working to develop a series of resources that we can start to share with these communities, both developed internally by the NAR initiative, as well as linking great resources like what's happening today and trying to get that in the hands and in front of the communities that we work to serve. So if you're interested, there's a link there, as I mentioned, to usu.edu/GNAR. That'll give you access to our website and some of the work we've been doing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been hearing. If you go to the next slide, excuse me. Really, I guess the major point is old existing issues are really being exacerbated. Recreation, visitation, traffic, these things have always been, well, not always, but recently have been a challenge in gateway communities, and they are just being the challenge is growing under COVID-19. One thing we are seeing that is interesting is these rec and visitation patterns are changing, as Tara mentioned, and these might become longer term patterns. If you can go to the next slide. So just for example, a place that was near to where I used to live, Gunlock Reservoir, a little teeny reservoir outside of St. George. This was a post by the state parks, and it says May 2nd, but this was at 10 in the morning. They sent out a tweet to notify everybody that the parks were closed because they were being basically overwhelmed with visitors. And these are very small state parks that are having to take the overflow from national parks and other recreation areas that had been closed and remain closed. So we're seeing some impacts, and as Danya mentioned, at a regional scale, it's really showing the relationship and the way that people move around these hot spots when they're not available. So the other thing we're seeing, obviously, there are significant economic challenges happening, and I think other people will talk to those we're having issues where communities have depended on outside, maybe even international workers to come do jobs over the summer, and the ability to bring those people in has been terminated really by this pandemic. And then so you have a kind of a dual-edged sword. You didn't have the people traveling internationally, and you can't have the workforce traveling internationally. So some places are just writing off this summer because there's no workforce, and even if the tourists come, it's not enough. It's not worth it for their time to bring in local people to try to do the work if they exist. We're seeing relationships with parks and public land managers being really brought to the test. If there was a good, strong relationship there, that's bearing fruit in the ability to coordinate opening and the ability to work together. If those relationships didn't work, or they've never been there, it's becoming a real challenge for these communities to effectively work with the regions and the land managers around them. We're also seeing a concern about really looking further down the road about amenity migration, meaning people who now are working from home or have been allowed to work from home have realized that maybe they don't need to live in the larger urban communities that they're from. So the desire, if you can work from home and you now see your tightly packed community as a disease source and maybe a place of social unrest, a place that is beautiful and where you can distance yourself, is looking more and more attractive. And so, on the horizon, I think it's if we look through the crystal ball, that there is some tendency or some logic to another wave of amenity migrants starting to look to these gateway communities. But we do see on the flip side some really some innovative ways that communities are looking at this as an opportunity to really reset and to look at the way they built themselves and to question, is what we're doing sustainable? And should we continue on the course that we're going on? And some communities are seeing this moment of realization community-wide, where maybe they were just a few people concerned about it. The community is very, very much acutely aware of some of these challenges, and they're seeing it as an opportunity to start those conversations towards maybe a different future for some of these gateway communities. So it is a difficult and challenging time, but we're seeing a lot of these communities, we're calling it a probopportunity, taking a problem and making it an opportunity. And that's an exciting field for us to be in the NAR initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. And now I'm looking forward to hearing from Darla Sidles, who's the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park, and how her park is handling this crisis. I know that this is a park that, like many others in the West, has seen some explosive growth over the last decade or so. Darla?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Very glad to be with you all here today. Thanks so much for the invitation. Go ahead and go to the second slide. So I wanted to talk specifically about some of the challenges that we had and are still having as we implement a park reopening amidst COVID. And since this is such a collaborative group, I think it makes sense to also elaborate on the park closing on March 20th. That was very much in communication and coordination with the gateway communities of both Estes Park and Grand Lake, as well as our public health service, recognizing that Estes Park and Grand Lake often have higher percentages of high-risk people, again, small towns, limited medical resources, wastewater and sewage sort of concerns with large numbers of people in town. And so that closing was done very much jointly between the park and the surrounding communities. So we were closed for a little over 2 months, and certainly in a national park, you've got a lot of challenges with just, opening the door again. And for one, we have a lot of different sets of guidelines, right? We've got, because we're national parks, we have the federal guidelines. We've got the Colorado State Public Health Service and CDC guidelines. We have the 3 counties within which Rocky resides. And then we have the town's guidelines. And so trying to coordinate between all of those various levels of protocols. It was very challenging. The Department of the Interior did say you can't try to follow state guidelines, and so we were able to do that, working very closely with all of the different entities to try to be as consistent as possible, even though there was a lot of differences there. We were not able to bring on any staff until May 24th, other than our critical health, life, and safety patrol rangers. So that obviously presented some challenges in terms of, how do you bring on 200 seasonals from all across the country that late, get them on, get them trained, and have them in place in order to be able to open the park. We also had a number of people who had applied for jobs and gotten them, and then they quit due to COVID for whatever reason. And then because we weren't collecting fees from some point in February through the time that we were closed, there was no funding to pay that staff. So we do have a lower staff level than we normally do. So that's just a recognition of the realities of what we're going through this summer. In terms of housing, we house about 200 seasonal employees per year. And obviously that was a challenge this year with trying to follow public health service guidelines and CDC guidelines, federal guidelines, only putting one person per bedroom into a house, as opposed to sometimes 2 or 3 in the larger dorms, that sort of thing. So the housing has definitely impacted us with fewer staff, but again, the communities have come to the table and offered lodging within the town at a lower reduced rate to staff. So that's really been helpful as well. As far as new safety protocols and mitigations, plenty of them. They're continually coming out from Washington, from the regional office, about how to clean now, what the protocols are, and mitigations. It takes quite a long time to get some of those things in place. And then the final thing, in terms of the challenges of reopening, we were concerned about the issue of overcrowding within the park that would not only impact the park, but also the surrounding communities. So the big takeaway here with how we've been successful with all this is working with all of our community leaders to find these solutions and to talk about what the issues are and how do we jointly solve them together. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a quick primer, if you haven't been to Rocky lately, it's the 3rd most visited national park in the country. We've had a significant increase in the last number of years. We are the 3rd most visited park with 4.6 million people. So even last year, when you look at our visitation statistics, in 1 month, we had nearly 1 million visitors. So just kind of trying to, show the picture of what Rocky normally has been looking like in the last number of years. And I got a couple of photos to illustrate that. If you could go to the next slide. Just a couple of photos there of a little bit of crowding there at trailheads and along trails at some of our more popular areas in the park. Go to the next slide. And then that's what some of our traffic problems have looked like for the last number of summers. So it's not only the number of people, but it's the number of vehicles as well. So this was obviously what was concerning us as we thought about how are we going to be able to open safely and not impact either immediate closing or impact the gateway communities. Next slide. So as we start thinking about how do we, increase access to the park while providing some reasonable opportunity for the public to be compliant with COVID-19 health guidelines, we started talking about implementing a timed entry reservation system, and this happened really very quickly. I was surprised we were able to get it together as quickly as we could. We had numerous discussions and presentations with both Senator Gardner and Senator Bennett's office, Congressman Niehaus, Colorado State, Estes Park, Grand Lake, all 3 counties surrounding the park, and the Public Health Service. And we've also got a group that we're working very closely with. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called NoCo Places 2050, and it's a collaborative group of people from all across the Colorado Front Range, 5 counties represented there, as well as the state of Colorado, the Forest Service, and Rocky Mountain National Park. And that's a really good model, I think, in terms of trying to share successes in how we are all trying to grapple with various stages of visitation management. So that group has been instrumental. And then, of course, support from National Parks Conservation Association. Working with all of these groups, we managed to get in the timed entry reservation system, which was just approved. We started on June the 4th. So we don't even have a full week. I guess we do now just have a full week of operations under the reservation system under our belt. We're the first national park in the country to have received authority to do this. Yosemite National Park just joined us yesterday. So now there are 2 national parks that are doing a park-wide sort of visitation reservation. And as you can see here, if we can get people to plan ahead so that they are looking on the web, looking at the Gateway Communities websites, trying to find out what's open, what's not. I think that's very key because there's really nothing I'm aware of that's operating as normal this year. We have had so far about 80% compliant with the reservation system. The vast majority of people come right up to the park entrance and they've got their reservation, no problem. Obviously, there's the challenge with others who don't quite have the capability, maybe, or don't really understand, and we're trying to help them as they figure out how to make a reservation. Again, the towns have been really, really helpful with this in terms of communicating how to make a reservation. It's in everybody's best interest to be able to open the park without overwhelming it completely and having to close. And so. So far, so good. Again, a week under our belt. I think the jury's out, so maybe we'll have a follow-up conference at the end of the summer to find out how it went. But certainly this is a temporary response just to COVID. It's not long. It's not intended to be, perpetual. So I think it's a smart approach to being able to manage our visitors, give them a good opportunity. The ones that have, been in the park are just thrilled with the experience. And so far, win-win. We've got, like I say, the communities are all on board. Certainly we do get folks who are resistant to getting a permit. That I think is just going to be the way of the world, but the vast majority of people get it and they're willing to plan a little in advance to have that opportunity. And the last slide there, just a photo of the very first day of us opening with timed entry last Thursday. You see a visitor there with their pass, and our staff is safely scanning it. And then on the right, the very same day, another good example of our wonderful relationship with our Gateway Communities, and that's our annual ribbon cutting at the very top of Trail Ridge Road, where we opened the highway across the Continental Divide. And we've got officials from Grand Lake, Estes Park, and Grand County. So successful, wonderful relationships. It makes all the difference in the world. And that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Darla. That's really great. And we will be getting back to you with many more questions. Next, we're going to hear from Mayor Emily Niehaus of Moab. And she will give us the perspective from Gateway Communities in the West. Thanks.
Thanks, Tara. Can you hear me? Can I do a sound check with you?
Yes, we can definitely hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. My name is Emily. I think I've got some pixelated pictures here on my slideshow, so I apologize for that. That's me on my paddleboard in the Grand Canyon. So like braving the waters, which has been very relevant as being a mayor going through a pandemic. It's much like running the Grand Canyon on a paddleboard. But also, I mentioned that at the bottom of this slide, MOM, Mayor of Moab, is also mom. And for a lot of us that have been dealing with COVID, we've also been dealing with our children not being at school and the added pressure of that. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to all of the parents that have been working 2 jobs through this pandemic, both doing your day job and then also schooling from home. So shout out to all of you moms and dads and caregivers. So go to the next slide for me, please. I wanted to share the like a good spaghetti Western, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it's like to be a gateway community through this pandemic. It's just a little bit about Moab. We are rural and remote. We are 2 hours from the nearest Walmart. It's very difficult to, if not impossible, to buy a pair of underwear in Moab, unless it's technical underwear. The hospital has a bed capacity of 17. However, our hospital doesn't have an ICU. So anytime there is a serious situation, health situation, our hospital packages the person up and ships them off to a hospital that has an ICU. So that's particularly concerning when we talk about dealing with this pandemic. And we just with the shutdown, we were able to get 2 ventilators for our hospital, which we didn't have before. We were lucky enough to in Moab really flatten the curve and get our business together so that we could deal with a reopening. And that's really where we are right now. I wish I could say that we were through this pandemic in true reflection form, but we are still very much in the thick of it. So let me tell you the local story of what's happening. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The good thing about Moab is that we are just surrounded by amazing public lands and have created the opportunity for people to come and raft and kayak and bike and climb and base jump even. We are just full of recreation here in Moab. And when we think of economic diversification, we can actually celebrate the fact that our recreation, we have diversification within recreation. So we have a lot of different users that come to Moab and pack very different things in their gear bags, but all come to play and enjoy the outdoors. And we think about the impact that visitation has on our community. The good impact is that we get a lot of funding. We've got a lot of sales tax that pays for things like a swimming pool, public swimming pool, park improvements, road improvements, sustainability efforts. We really spend our dollars wisely, and we're really lucky to have those dollars because of our tourism-based economy. It's important to celebrate tourism before we get into the next slide, which is the bad. And I want to, Darla, thanks for showing your pictures of congestion. I wanted to show just like sort of the classic congestion. And again, sorry for my very pixelated pictures here, but Arches National Park reopened on May 29th. And just after 9 a.m., they had to close the gate because of congestion. We are also discussing a timed entry system here, a temporary timed entry system here. And we've got local support for it. Both the city and the county and the town of Castle Valley have supported written letters of support for the temporary timed entrance system. But And so, Darla, thanks for explaining that for everybody, because that's kind of a capacity thing. As we're looking at congestion, we are led to this conversation about capacity. But I also think that it's important to note that, when we're talking about the bad, we have a lack of affordable housing. We have lower wages as a result of our tourism-based economy. The classic complications or unintended consequences that come with being such a narrowly based tourism-based economy. And to the next slide, when we think about the ugly, we operate kind of chugging along, and we run the trains until there's a big rock on the tracks, and then we have to halt. And this is just a very badly pixelated picture of a empty downtown Moab. When we went into our shutdown in mid-March, we all agreed that it was an important thing to do to be able to flatten the curve and protect the residents of Moab, as well as to build our capacity to deal with a pandemic. And almost 3 months later, as we reopen, we realize that the majority of the income that we receive annually, whether it's the business or the city of Moab, is really concentrated within 6 months. So we essentially, through the shutdown, lost half of our annual revenue. That really is the dark side of a tourism-based economy and a lack of economic diversification. And that's the tough reality. Go ahead and go to the next slide for me. Unless there isn't a next slide in this presentation. Oh, there we go. There is. So what is our post-pandemic work? Oh, go back one. Sorry. This post-pandemic work, and the slide that I prepared was actually the viewing different kinds of seeds. When we think of diversification, when we think of recreation diversification, maybe it's climbing, biking, rafting. When we think of economic diversification, we're really looking at what this new normal could look like for Moab. Can we really attract and retain innovation and individuals in tech and education? Short term, our new normal is going to be like what you were saying, Tara, with the outdoor dining options. Also, I encourage everybody to consider coming to Moab in the summer. We're a great place for sunrise hikes, sunset hikes, whitewater recreation, and otherwise just being lazy at a hotel pool, because if you're like me, you still have a lot of work to get done. And if you have children, you can send them to the pool to play while you sit in a nice air-conditioned hotel room and do your work. I would say that from the state, Tara, you asked, what can the state do? I think that listening to towns and cities like Moab saying, hey, we've got recreation, we need diversification in other sectors, but then also listening to communities that are looking to expand their recreation and tourism base, and pointing visitors positive in those directions as well, and helping those towns actualize diversification through tourism. A couple more things that I wanted to share. We talk about how to be a sustainable community. I like to think of the term regenerative. So if we get more people, that could be more more resource. More humans doesn't necessarily need to equate to more degradation. And so it's how we use our resource that's important. So I want to be a regenerative community and lead in that way. And a couple other fun points. Moab is the size of Manhattan geographically. We've controlled the way that we've grown, through zoning. We have height restrictions for our buildings. We have setbacks. Same goes true for what Arches is looking at doing with this timed entry system. And I'm really grateful, Darla, for your presentation and discussion more about that, because as we look at the new normal, we are going to have conversations around capacity. Thanks for letting me talk today.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm going to ask one more point before I get into every a question of you, Emily, while you're still on, and that is, with gateway communities having this really unique relationship with the outdoor industry, has that relationship changed with this experience, and how would that industry be able to invest in communities to help support it moving forward?
Well, I wrote a letter a month ago, I guess now, although it's hard to track time over the past 3 months. I wrote a letter to the outdoor industry and to the state saying, "Hey, we're looking to reopen. I'm asking my partners to help. We need face masks for visitors and for our residents." And we received 75,000 masks donated from the state, and a whole pile of PPE from the outdoor recreation industry. Um, and I think what I see is that the outdoor recreation industry loves Moab. And as I've been going around town, seeing the donated PPE has been pretty amazing. Goal Zero, in particular, gave Moab residents a pile of buffs. And I went to the grocery store yesterday, and there were a dozen employees wearing their Goal Zero buffs. So there's so much, uh, mutual respect between, I think, the community and our partners in the outdoor recreation industry in terms of manufacturers, but then also our guides. I mean, we it's been a bit heartbreaking, I think, to see my friends not be able to be of service to others, coming to Moab and guiding them on river trips and backpacking trips and hiking and biking and climbing. So yeah, it's bittersweet, I would say, as we're moving into this new normal.
Well, thank you so much. And by the way, I've got an idea for you. We will talk at another point, but and that would be about the guides and outfitters. Um, Going into this discussion, let's get back with Danya. Danya, you'd mentioned that Sandpoint was booming. I'm also from the Pacific Northwest, from just across the border in Spokane, so I'm very well aware of that. I mean, originally from there. Um, and it's booming because people are moving in. A lot of Californians and others have moved into that area, but have the shutdowns really affected that trend of uh, these shutdowns, especially in these larger cities, affected this trend with moving towards Sandpoint and other gateway communities? Would you say?
Yeah, so first, actually, I want to just pick up on your last question about the recreation industry. And as you, Tara, know,
Oh
since
yeah.
your office helped facilitate this connection, the North Face, the company, is actually helping support our Gateway and Natural Amenity Region initiative because they, like Emily was talking about, like they see how important these communities are as partners and how important it is to help them through this and to kind of keep those recreation, the infrastructure of the communities, not just actual physical infrastructure, but the actual community in place and healthy to support the recreation industry. So I just want to echo what Emily was saying and see that we're seeing that more broadly, as I'm sure Tara can speak to more as well. In terms of the question about Sandpoint, I actually looked up a particular quote from one of our recent engagements with a number of gateway communities. And one of my colleagues, a planner up in Sandpoint, said verbatim, "Get ready for the onslaught of remote workers." So I can't tell you exactly what they're seeing right now. I suspect with everything being so crazy in the world, not a ton of people are currently moving, although I think people are going to their second homes. Like there's been a real flight to second homes. So there's sort of been a swelling related to that perhaps. But I think these places, a lot of them, especially those that have just such a high quality of life and are not only recreation hotspots, but are very much like come live here hotspots. I think they see the writing on the wall that things are going to change for them. And one of the challenges that they've already experienced is that when you have a number of remote workers coming from, say, Silicon Valley or from New York, moving to your community, but still holding a job in Southern California or on the East Coast, the income to housing ratio gets way out of whack. And we've already seen that in Sandpoint, where the average housing price is just so out of reach for people who actually live and work in the community. And a big part of that's driven perhaps by second home ownership, but actually increasingly by remote workers who just have salaries that are so different from those who actually work in the region. So there are a number of challenges that kind of migration, amenity migration, presents, especially that kind of remote worker migration that we're very likely to see. The flip side of that, the sort of opportunity, as Jake said earlier, is that these communities, as Emily spoke to quite well, are looking to diversify their economies. And so that migration can perhaps be a source of diversification. And it just matters how it happens, right? Because if people are employed remotely and bringing salaries that are totally out of whack with what the community can bear in terms of housing prices and other things, that will create problems. But if we can find a way to harness that amenity migration so it actually builds the community and the social structure of the community and doesn't change that dynamic in a really unproductive way or make housing totally unaffordable, it could be a real boon. And so I think that actually going to your earlier question, Tara, from the state role is can states help these communities envision a future for themselves with a more diverse economy, but not just grabbing anything they can, because grabbing anything you can might not be sustainable, but actually being really thoughtful about the kind of community you want to be. How do you grow in a sustainable way? What infrastructure do you need to put in place in advance? How do you engage the old timers, the people who've been there a long time, and actually welcoming the newcomers? Because often there's real tension between those people moving into these communities and those who've been there a long time. And I think states have a real role to help, especially these places that are so small and often don't have a lot of public officials, to help them get ready and to plan and be ready to manage that growth.
I think that's a great point, Danya, and definitely something that would be a good conversation to expound on another day. But traditionally, the newcomers would come in and create small businesses that would employ townspeople, ideally. And it's hoped that in this work with remote learning opportunities, that perhaps that shift can also be created. Or other ways to employ people in the town. Shifting into Jake, you'd mentioned capacity building, and one of our attendees asked for you to expand on that and what that might mean and how that might occur.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I use that term pretty broadly because we try to keep it broad in order to flex and adjust to what we feel the communities are asking of us. But one of the things that is kind of fun about working with gateway communities is they're pretty innovative. They try new things, and because they're fairly small, they get a lot of stuff done without maybe as many bureaucratic levels as a larger community might have. And so what we're trying to do when we talk about capacity building at a very basic level is get communities to share what they're doing and some of the challenges they've encountered and how they're overcoming those challenges through some of those peer-to-peer learning networks, and getting people communicating with each other as communities, but also communicating with resource providers or service providers, such as federal or state entities. So trying to showcase and model to them what building those networks are. And I think the example of Rocky Mountain National Park moving very quickly on a very complex issue because they had a network of strong relationships that came to this pandemic already built is a great example of a model that we would like to maybe demonstrate or showcase to other communities. So when it comes to capacity building, it's providing those networks, but it's also listing and finding what resources they need and linking those communities up with those resources. So one thing we're also working on is developing an online toolkit of sorts, or a series of toolkits and information that communities can also use, and that's available now in sort of a beta form on our website. But we are continually working to develop those specific toolkits, as well as developing case studies so that communities can look to examples, both good, bad, and ugly, as was mentioned in Moab, so that people can really get an idea of where they're at in time and in decision making space, and then view what other communities have done and make adjustments accordingly.
Well, thank you so much. And I definitely would recommend to those who are listening in to connect to this NAR initiative. They have listening sessions, they have webinars going on, and you can get much more information from them. I'm also noticing as I look at the messages, my friend Patrick Davis from the EPA has passed on a link for the EPA guidance for the coronavirus cleaning and disinfecting of public places. That would be good to pass that on to folks. That can really be helpful as our gateway communities are wanting to share this kind of information with all of their businesses. And I know that I have passed that on to others, and there are some great graphics on their pages as well. So this question is for Darla. And Erica brings this up. One of the listeners, she says, Denali National Park in Alaska has been doing a timed entry since June 1st as well to allow private vehicles to enter certain points along the road. Can you expand on your experience with timed entry? And somebody else asks, how are you dealing with that timed entry and afternoon thunderstorms that do crop up?
Right. Yeah, thank you. And please let me know if you can't hear me. My
You're coming
connection
in.
looks like okay, good. It's showing I'm 20% lost capacity. But okay, so again, with our timed entry, yeah, we did implement it very quickly in recreation.gov is the contractor that manages that system. They were able to build a system for us in about 2 weeks. Now, granted, this was it's a fairly rudimentary system. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles that would be ideal, that we could get if we took more time. But it essentially, gives us the bare bones process to get people to plan ahead. The tickets are $2. So you log on to recreation.gov, you select the date and the 2-hour time block of entry. So we've divided up the day by 2-hour blocks of entry. So you come in within, say, 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. or 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. You can stay all day. You can even go outside of the park and come back in, but you do have to enter the park that first time during that 2-hour window. And you're right about the thunderstorm activity in the summer. Often, we try to help people advance plan and tell them if they're going on a long hike, they need to be down by noon because of the thunderstorms. And so, granted, that 12 to 2 o'clock time frame may not be as popular. Obviously, the early morning time frames, the mid morning are by far the most popular anyway. That's the kind of bell curve that we see when people come in to hike. They know they need to come in earlier to be out. But we're still filling up the 12 to 2 p.m. time slots as well as the 2 to 3 and the 3 to 4. And so I think, if it's a matter of not getting to see it all or going ahead and taking your chance on a time where it might rain, people are going ahead and doing that.
Well, thank you so much. If we have one more, just a second more, Laura. Gregory Miller asks, has a good question for Emily. What percentage of the total Moab budget is tourism based? Is it 100%? And how much has that dropped off? Those receipts coming in due to the COVID impacts, and what's the short-term unemployment, and what's that effect been like on the local and seasonal employees that you have?
Big question. So let's start with Moab City budget first. So 30 years ago, the poor kids of Moab that had just gone through a uranium shutdown, a mining shutdown, got together and said, we got to capitalize on this tourism thing. And at that point, they said, let's not charge a property tax. So fast forward 30 years later, abundance of sales tax dollars and never having re-implemented a property tax for the city of Moab. So other than fees that we receive from like say when you if you're building a home, you've got your your permit and your building inspection fees like that. We do collect money through fees, but we don't collect a property tax. Well, not yet anyway. This has been a huge magnifying glass on our budget. So that's been for the city. So yes, we are really tourism based with our city budget. As for the community, Grand County reported the highest unemployment rates for the state of Utah. I'm not sure if I'm not sure where we landed with our final percentage, but being the community with the highest unemployment rate is kind of like you never want to be the best at that thing. So it's really nothing for us to brag about. When I started talking, I mentioned that I'm also a mom, and I think we're seeing shifts in our workforce because our kids didn't have school to go to. Parents had to make a tough decision who was going to stay home with the kids. And, not to go off on a feminist tangent, but largely, we see a difference in pay between men and women. And so, whoever makes more money goes to work, continues to work. So we're just seeing a lot of sort of the unintended consequences of depending so much on a tourism-based economy and the money that we receive and the unemployment that we're seeing. And hopefully that answers your question in terms of like budget for Moab, but then also unemployment with our county.
And you see that. Thank you for highlighting the struggles of working moms. Thank you so much, Emily.
The struggle is real.
Yeah, the struggle's real. I just wanted to, as we close, we talked about the afternoon storms that we have in the Rocky Mountain National Park and that we experience across the West. And sometimes we have these big storms and somebody brought up this point that her father used to say to me in her discussion. She said, we have these big storms. They do cause this destruction, but after the storm comes the rainbow and these opportunities for new growth. And I hope that's the case with our gateway communities, that there can be this new, beautiful growth. Maybe it's different, but and I hope that as states, and with federal help and coming together and working to have that capacity to come together, that we really can help these gateway communities to recover and to stay healthy, both physically and economically, and to thrive in the years to come. And I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I will turn it back over to you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was a really great conversation. So I want to say thank you again to all of the panelists. We did have a couple more questions from the audience that didn't get answered, so we can reach out to you post-webinar with email answers to those questions. And I also just want to say thank you to everyone for attending this webinar under the Working Lands Roundtable. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, you can learn more about the Working Lands Roundtable and find more information on WGA's website at westgov.org/initiatives. And we have another webinar in this series next Friday, June 19th, that will be covering restarting resources-dependent economies. So I hope to see you all at that. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.